Welcome everyone to the Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit. My name is Stacey Dixon. I'm the forester for Snohomish and Whidbey Island Conservation Districts, and I'm happy to get us started today. So this is the part 3 of a 4-part virtual series, and we're actually building on an event that happened last year, and we will culminate in an in-person event this fall. So today's session is Diversifying Revenue and Values, and you can see the partners for this session down below. We have Forest Stewards Guild, Intertribal Timber Council, Northwest Natural Resource Group, Oregon State University, and College of the Environment, University of Washington. What is the Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit? This summit builds on long, deep, and often underappreciated history of experimentation and innovation in the Pacific Northwest. We see it as a first step to chart a course for improving sustainable forest management through partnerships and problem solving. Provides a venue for regional learning, exchange, and ongoing cooperation to implement ecologically sound forest management strategies. And its ongoing, intentional effort to connect, innovate, and uplift each other and our ideas in the realm of forests and forestry in the Pacific Northwest. So welcome. As part of the session today, we invite you to join the Mighty Network, which is an online social media platform that's ad-free, where we can share ideas, exchange articles, and continue discussions that start today. Our path today is that we will try to bridge this session and the goals for this session with the last 2 virtual sessions. We'll introduce you to our amazing panelists. We have a set of questions that we've prepared for the panel, but we will also leave time for questions from the audience. So please keep that in mind today. And then we will close out our session at 5. Just some ground rules. This is all very familiar to you all by this point, but if you could please change your name to your full name and your association on Zoom, that would be great. So we all know where people are coming from. Keep yourself muted during the presentations, but feel free to use the chat. We will monitor the chat as we go forward today. And please be respectful of each other, as always. When it's time for audience engagement and participation, we ask that you listen actively and try to understand each other's views, respect diversity and opinions that differ from your own, and criticize ideas, not individuals. Commit to learning, not debating, and allow everyone a chance to speak. So with that, it's my honor to introduce Greg Ettl, who will be our moderator for today. Greg is director of the Center for Sustainable Forestry at Pac Forest in the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. As director, he oversees management of a 4,300-acre working forest, as well as research, education, and outreach activities. His research focuses on sustainable forestry, including silviculture, ecophysiology, ecosystem services, forest responses to climate change, agroforestry, and forest ecology. Thanks, Greg.
Oh, thanks, Stacey. Like a big thanks to Stacey and Rowan Braybrook, who did almost all the heavy lifting in making this session happen, really. And then Alex, who's on my screen in the upper right, has been really helpful in making sure that we get off the ground, and more is somewhere here in terms of organizing and having our infrastructure and advertising going. None of this would happen without everyone's contribution. So I really appreciate all of that. This is the 3rd of a 4th virtual series. The virtual series are really awesome in the way that we have people from kind of places that otherwise it'd be difficult for us to get together. The virtual series has some limitations too. We know we don't get to talk to the people we want to talk to a little bit during those important break times. I want to remind us of where we've been with the first 2 sessions, and then at the end, think about how we're going to connect to a final session for this April series. Okay, so in the first of the series, we had a look at some emerging kind of issues for forest landowners, practitioners, and managers, and others who might not fit that category. And thinking about things or worrying about, in some cases, the effects of climate change on forests, the impact of invasive species, needs and availability of forest workers, coordinating small forest landowners towards common management themes where they might not have a common voice otherwise, and hopes for revenue streams beyond timber. Last week, we had this really kind of fascinating discussion that looked at sort of the process of storytelling and working on narratives in relation to Pacific Northwest forests and forestry. And through that conversation, these same themes came up. That is the idea of kind of changing the stories as they relate to increasing impacts of climate change, changes in management organizations, the way that people relate to each other and between groups or among groups in doing forestry and forest management, and the emerging carbon and development rights markets and how that has been kind of impacting this kind of conversation. In fact, we had one example during last week's discussion about the Department of Natural Resources actually putting a forest carbon project together. And this is an example of a pretty large project, and that within a public agency is unique-ish, right? And interesting and a new potential path forward. All right, so part of what came out of last week's conversation were these things I mentioned, but part of it was sort of a reframing of what we've been talking about for a very long time in terms of who should be making the decisions on what forest landowners do. In today's conversation, the focus comes from thinking about forest landowners, land managers, rural community perspectives, and what they might need in terms of being able to diversify values and revenue streams for their land. So I'm hoping that you'll find that useful in terms of our discussions, our ongoing discussions. So the way we're going to do this is we have a panel to help us think about these opportunities, if you will from many different directions. And I haven't met any of these panelists before, so this is really exciting for me and my sort of pleasure and honor to introduce all of you. And I hope I get your details in a way that is consistent with what you had hoped for. So I'm going to start with an alphabetical order is the way I think we're doing this. Ben Deumling. Ben manages Zena Forest, a 1,300-acre family-owned forest in the heart of the Willamette Valley, and also Zena Forest Products, which I assume is on the same property, but I haven't been there. Ben has been actively engaged in forest policy matters and holds a bachelor's degree from Whitman College, where he studied natural resource policy in the Western US. Next, Dr. Cristina Eisenberg is a courtesy faculty at Oregon State University, Native American and Latinx ecologist of mixed Rara and Western Apache heritage. I'm sorry, I don't know that tribe if I've got the name wrong. She works to help build government-to-government partnerships with tribal nations and federal agencies in a manner that respects sovereignty and treaty rights and advances social and environmental justice. Carrie Fisher is the senior manager of carbon, energy, and ecosystem services for the value-added services team at Manulife Investment Management, Timberland, and Agriculture, I think formerly known as Hancock in a general sense. Yeah, okay. Casey's role is to maximize natural resource investments beyond traditional revenue streams such as carbon, banks, renewable energy, and ecosystem service projects, monetizing enhanced wildlife habitat, mineral agreements, enhanced recreation opportunities, and timber byproducts. And then last on my list alphabetically, but still only at K really, so not used to probably being last alphabetically, is Dr. Ellen Kelly, who's professor in the forestry department at the newly named Cal Poly Humboldt, or previously you might have known it as Humboldt State University. So congratulations on this this new role for the university. Dr. Kelly teaches policy and economics courses and has research interests. Oh, and her research interest centers on the human dimensions of forestry, including landowner management objectives, forest policy and regulations, rural community well-being, community forest, and carbon offset markets. Okay, well, with all of that, I've sort of fumbled around, and my apologies for any of this. Now we're going to ask each of the panelists to kick off with a little bit of a description of what they do. So the question is, what income streams or forest values do you specialize in? And how about we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So Kay gets to go first here. So Dr. Kelly, you would be up.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And thanks for inviting me to this session. This seems super interesting, and I look forward to learning from everybody. So I'm going to mostly have a California focus today. I've studied, as Greg mentioned, I've studied carbon markets. So in particular, the California cap and trade market and the role that forests play within that. I've also studied voluntary carbon markets. Actually, the Arcata Community Forest, which is publicly owned here, has a carbon project in a voluntary market. I guess in terms of other revenue streams, I've studied restoration funding. I mean, this is huge in California right now. Fuels reduction projects, so actually just revenue from the state to do certain projects. Biomass electricity and kind of its rise and fall over time within the state. And finally, I've studied ways that landowners diversify revenue on their own landscapes, so kind of competing or complementary uses of land. And around here, that's often grazing or agriculture, and particularly cannabis agriculture around here. I'm also interested, I'll just say, from my past life, I worked as a postdoc in Newfoundland, and I was really interested in subsistence uses there, which is a huge economic driver of how forests are managed there, mostly fuelwood gathering and moose hunting.
Thank you. That was awesome. So I guess if we're doing this in continued reverse order, Carrie Fisher, you'd be next, if you would, please.
I wish I was Carrie Fisher. Sorry.
Casey Fisher. I'm so sorry.
It's not the first time. That won't be the last time. You're okay.
And I'm reading your name as I say it too. So
well, I did have the name totally wrong, and I don't usually use Zoom. So sorry that I was Hancock camping for so long.
Well, we were confused by that, but we're good now.
I bet. Yeah, I wish that was my name too. I don't know. So at Value Added Services, the group that was sort of formed about 3 years ago at Manulife or Hancock Forest Management, Hancock Natural Resource Group, whichever one you want to call us, they sort of took nationally on the timber and ag side these projects that were not directly related to the primary asset, not timber or agriculture, and put them into one team. And so on my team, I've got a recreation expert, I've got an oil, gas, minerals expert, and then I am the person that's sort of running these new projects or all the leases, carbon mitigation banks. And so I kind of started, I came from the legal profession, not natural resources, but I really prefer this job to anything in the legal field. So I started with all the leases. And so we're talking renewables, wind, solar, storage. I'm even doing all the communication site leases, grazing leases. We've got some forecasted mitigation unit banks, voluntary compliance market, carbon banks, some mitigation opportunities that we're exploring, particularly in the West Coast recreation. So I do a little bit of everything. I've looked at a bunch of stuff that hasn't worked out, but I think it's a super exciting part of forestry to be able to overlay all these things. That's it for me.
Thank you. Super interesting. Okay, we'll get to follow up on that. All right, so next, I guess Cristina Eisenberg, please.
Yes, I work with tribal nations. My current work is in North America, but I previously done this type of work globally to empower them to restore their natural resources and manage their natural resources in keeping with sovereignty rights. And so I work very closely right now with the Department of the Interior with some of those infrastructure funds to lead and implement projects with specific tribal nations. I've done a lot of work on this in Montana, and I'm starting some projects in the Pacific Northwest looking at forest lands. The income streams, tribal nations have a very different ethic about how we relate with the natural world. Gifford Pinchot said, there's two things in this world. There's natural resources and people. Well, tribal nations, our values are that we're embedded in nature and we're stewards of nature. And so the values and the income stream start with cultural values, spiritual values, and subsistence, both traditional subsistence and monetary subsistence in the form of forest management, for example. So that's some of the work that I do. And really, I work to build capacity within these tribal nations because so often there isn't. And there has also been historically a huge disconnect between the federal government hasn't really known how to work effectively with tribal nations. So I'm one of the people that helps that happen. Also work with the US Congress on some of these points.
Okay, great. Very interesting. Ben, I guess you're last, but certainly not least. So please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for having me here. This is an honor. So my family takes care of and stewards a patch of forest lands, the Zena forest in the heart of the Willamette Valley. And it's a unique forest in that it is not Douglas fir dominant, like most of the forests in Western Oregon. It has a lot of hardwood on it. And so over the years, I've worked to try to figure out what we can do with this. And historically, there have not been good markets for many of the logs that come off of this forest. And so to that end, we built a sawmill and a mill workshop and have been experimenting with different products that we can make from this forest and ways to add value to those amazing trees that are growing here in the forest. And so to that end, we make a lot of hardwood flooring, which is sort of our primary product line these days, but not exclusively. And I've dabbled in just about anything you can imagine when it comes to wood products that you can put a value on. And so we still sell, lumber to boat builders, and our sawdust goes to a mushroom grower. And we, some of our high grade lumber we sell to furniture makers, and the list goes on. And we can go into more detail on some of the other things we've dabbled in over the years. But in essence, I've really been trying to figure out what all the different things are that we can make from these trees, and particularly with wood products. And it's been a fun adventure, and it's constantly a shifting landscape. And as new technologies come along, we come up with new products that we can make and new ways to make old products. And that's sort of my focus. And it's personal for me. This is our family forest land, and this is where I grew up, and this is where I always knew I wanted to be. And the sawmill and mill workshop really is a means to an end. It's a way to allow me to continue to live and work here and earn a living off of a fairly small patch of forest. The forest is 1,300 acres. And in order to keep the mill going, we source from other forests in the surrounding area as well. But really the overarching reason that we do what we do is to find ways to generate revenue from small patches of land that don't have traditional revenue sources of Douglas fir logs. So that's a nutshell of what we do.
Yeah, no, that's great. So this question is going to go to everybody, but Ben, since I have you off of mute, you might start with like, what are your biggest obstacles, to being able to sort of operate and take advantage of sort of this mixed revenue stream, a non-traditional timber revenue stream?
I think all of these obstacles really boil down to communication and telling a story. And it's easy to sell Douglas fir logs to the big sawmills. That's a pipeline that exists. But everything else is non-traditional. That's why we're here having this conversation. And we're bucking a trend. We're trying to create something new. And with that comes storytelling and education and outreach and communication to sort of explain what we do and why it's important and why, buying a piece of flooring that was grown in Oregon as opposed to Indiana or China is valuable. And so I think for me, it's an opportunity and an obstacle at the same time of communication and storytelling and trying to communicate why these values are important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to, of the other panelists here wants to work into that in some way. I mean, the same question, of course, applies. What are the challenges? But I also am drawn to this question of what's the importance of the story, right? Like, when you're trying to engage in something that doesn't have a straightforward, obvious economic revenue stream ready for you, like how important is that story to it, to actually developing that sort of product? Anyway, I'll let one of you jump in.
I mean, I'll piggyback. I think that the biggest obstacle is really understanding and I guess conveying the risk, because it's something that's new, or everybody's cozy in their timber asset investment. They all get it, and you're like gonna throw out some crazy new idea. But for a new thing to come and exist, you have to truly understand what you're risking and what could be your missed opportunity, or what could change the value of the timber. I think that we spend a lot more time just trying to, all the potential problems that we need to go down the path for to get it to the point that I'm comfortable even proposing it to people as an opportunity. That's my biggest, because a lot of the stuff that we look at has never really been put into play, and so you're communicating with all sorts of different people, and it's not not your immediate go-to. It's not a forestry question. It's a agronomic question, or it's a supply question, and so I think that's my big obstacle.
Others?
I was thinking of this question more from the perspective of how those economic opportunities are actually created, like how they come to be, less about landowners kind of buying in. And I'll say from a carbon market perspective, it took this huge amount of funding from the state. It was a created market, that had to be developed, that then forest landowners could join. And so there was some certainty, I guess, to address Casey's point. There was this certainty created by this state created market. But one of the barriers that I see is just how we sort of, as consumers, think about wood products. Like in creating markets, California is, just as an example, it's this huge market that gets almost all of its wood and wood products from out of the state, almost all of them. It's something around more than 70%. So we're dealing with a big consumer that has this environmental ethic that is not producing, doesn't extend that ethic to like producing locally. And so I guess one of the ways I'd love people to think differently about this is just that sort of farm to table model. And I was trying to think of a catchy way to say that with wood. I was like, well, wood to table, because tables are made of wood sometimes. But I don't know, something about that could be a way to create markets where I just think, at least in California, we're just having this kind of crisis of mills going away and almost no markets for small diameter wood to be processed. So.
Cristina, did you want to jump in?
Yes. Well, for tribal nations, the barriers and obstacles are, we share some of the same concerns that have been raised here, but also most tribal nations lost all their land through the termination process. And in the Pacific Northwest, it's been a huge effort with a lot of acrimony and lawsuits for tribes like the Klamath, the Coos, the Cow Creek Band to regain some timberlands. And there have been federal lands ceded to these tribes. And the challenge is that if you have everything taken away from you, lands that were supposed to be yours through treaties, and then you get them back, and then you don't have, or you get a portion of them back, you totally lack the capacity to manage them. And then on top of that, some of these timberlands are quite valuable, and there's policy issues having to do with northern spotted owl. And so the conservation community tried to block tribes from getting their land. So there is a very poor understanding of indigenous forest stewardship practices that include things like prescribed burning, managing for diversity, managing for sustained yield as well. There's some really cool work taking place, for example, with the Klamath tribes, but we're just at the beginning of this new era of tribal forestry. So anyway, and then you layer on top of that all the types of challenges that all of you mentioned, and it gets really interesting.
It's super interesting. I want to first allow an opportunity for any of you to sort of build on what Cristina was talking about in relation to tribal, if you have a way that makes sense from what we were talking about before I want to come back to this kind of organic farmer, market type approach of farm to table type thinking. But let's first see if we can build on the tribal connection.
I'll add on to that just briefly. Thanks, Cristina, for bringing up tribal ownership, because it's huge in Northern California. You might know that there's been a lot of land return here, including from industry to tribes directly, to the Yurok tribe. And some of that has been using carbon markets to help finance some of those transactions, which has a lot of interesting sovereignty questions, because then there's rules under the state about what you can do. But I do think ownership matters a lot. And I guess just in thinking about how do you start diversifying income opportunities, I feel like tribes have, if you're just thinking of it from a strictly economic perspective, they probably have some of the most diverse thoughts about, what's revenue, what's income, but also a super long timeline. And I think that that's really necessary for thinking about a lot of these different types of revenues, like having literally a super long timeline and a lot of patience, because a lot of the things that we're going to be thinking about today aren't going to be sort of big return immediately, anyway. So thanks for bringing that up, Cristina.
That was really great thoughts. Thanks, Erin.
I guess sort of pivoting just sort of to this idea of land ownership is one that I think about a lot, and I appreciate Cristina and Erin both bringing this up about transferring ownership. And my family happens to own a patch of forest lands, but I struggle with private property rights when it comes to forests, because forests provide so many Commonwealth benefits to all of us, whether we live in the forest or on the other side of the state. And I think that's sort of a big driver of this conversation about non-traditional forest products and non-traditional benefits that you can get from a forest, because the reality is all of the folks in this neighborhoods around where I live here derive benefits from this forest that my family happens to steward. And all of the folks in the greater market derive benefits from the products that we can provide. And so it has been squashed into this capitalist model, which has it works in certain ways, but I think the search for all other benefits from a forest, I think, are really, or for me at least, are really kind of rooted in how can this forest be greater than just me and my family who live here. And that's really, especially sort of some of the non-revenue generating things of recreation and hunting and things like that are really an important part of the mix of what these forests can provide. And revenue is important to pay the bills and maintain a forest and take care of it, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. These are questions that I've struggled with for years, and I don't know that I have answers, but it's something I think about.
So this is an ongoing question that's super interesting, right? Like you have some land, then I want to go to your land and walk around, see what you're doing, maybe take advantage of its resources in some way for my pleasure and knowledge. And you might want to come to Pack Forest and do that too. But do I have any rights to do that? Right? And who has these rights and how should they be allocated? And then when we start trying to build this story of, for those landowners that don't want to maximize revenue streams strictly, meaning they're looking for a way to diversify how they're able to quote monetize, right, to put this in economic terms, something else from their land. How do we do that, right? Like, how do we get someone to buy into it? It seems pretty easy when I want to grow an organic vegetable and sell it, that someone says, oh, I'm going to put this in my body, therefore I'm pretty discerning about what it is. But beyond that, how do we do this? Like, what are the challenges and what has been useful for all of you in terms of making progress and being able to diversify revenue streams? Stunned silence.
I'll bring up a new stream, and this is something I'm working with Congress on. All those mega fires we've been having in everywhere, really, but they're really devastating to the Pacific Northwest. They have to do with disruption, climate change, and disruption of forest management practices that have been going on for millennia, mainly prescribed burning by tribes. Nancy Turner, who you probably all know who she is, she did a lot of work on ethnobotany. She's not native, but she worked with a lot of tribal nations and looking at the forest understory and the traditional uses of those plants. Today, we've learned in Western science that those plants are soil stabilizing species that also greatly increase the nutrient flow in the understory that then supports growth of the overstory of the trees. So there's some of the funding I work with, and some of what I'm advising Congress on is to create seed production enterprises on tribal lands, focusing on those traditional plants, as if that's okay with those tribal nations, that they could then sell. There's a huge market. We don't have enough seeds for restoration. And then this becomes ecocultural restoration, and there's a critical need for it. There is a lot of federal funding for it. There's also opportunities for not just for tribal nations, for anybody, like for small landowners, for example, to get involved in this. And it's the Native Plant Conservation Program and the Seeds of Success Program. And so I'm focusing on working with tribal nations on this, but really anybody can work on this. In terms of the knowledge and who has the right, to spend time in a tribal forest that's been managed more for diversity and look at some of those plants, well, you have to be invited, but that's another thing I'm working on, is building those collaborations and helping create the rules of engagement that involve reciprocity. I believe that most of the tribal nations I work with are very interested in partnerships and information sharing. They're all really excited about Western science, and then we bring our traditional ecological knowledge, and so bringing them together. And that's also something that the White House is exploring, Secretary Haaland is exploring, and I've been advising her on that, is how do we make this happen? And that gets to the relationships you mentioned.
Yeah, that was great. Kind of playing into this, I really like this idea of trying to build those partnerships. I think that could be, a way to have a winning arrangement, if you will, on multiple fronts. Here we're interested in diversifying these revenue streams. So if someone were to be engaged in the cultural plant propagation, I think they would have maybe a need, to also then somehow be able to sell plants, right? Or products or something, right? So we want to be kind of thinking in that way too, which I guess brings me to this question of thinking about customer engagement. How do we actually engage with customers? How do we create markets? How do we enhance markets for products that I think we all might view as being really quite valuable parts of forests that we don't have good ways to monetize at this point?
I'll jump in for a second. I mean, I tend to think of this again as maybe as sort of top down, like there needs to be this real investment from, as it was with the carbon market, investment from the state to create a stable market. I mean, the same thing for biomass electricity in California used to be huge, and it kind of has lost some of its political support. It's become more nebulous, and it's really lost out to solar and wind. And I think people can debate biomass electricity, sort of its utility, but definitely there's this need to, in my mind, there's this need to think about how you use restoration byproducts. There's a need to think about that, and there's also a need to think about how you kind of get more jobs out in the woods. And so in talking, I sort of lost my train of thought, but basically my point is that in creating these markets, there has to be this in my mind, there really has to be a lot of push. And I was last year on a group that was thinking about funding headwaters, more headwaters funding to sort of link, one of the ideas was to link, there's all these headwaters that are located in forest lands, and a lot of that water ends up going to somebody downstream that's often in an urban place. In California, it often ends up way far away from its origin. And, how do you think about, or should you think about monetizing that? It's really hard to put a value to something without putting some dollars on it. And especially when you have so many forest health issues that require a lot of investment and time and energy. So I guess my thought is that you kind of use these top-down tools. You use state funding, you use creation of markets, but I'd love to hear other people's ideas.
I'm gonna Erin, steal yours too, because biomass has been like this, right? And it's the new best thing, and then it disappears. And we spent a lot of time on it in the SAF and the sustainable aviation fuels. And the idea that they would clear the residuals from a logging operation and use it to produce aviation fuel instead of us piling it and burning it or leaving it there to rot is an amazing idea. And if there was a top-down structure that could encourage that, it doesn't pencil out. You can't pull it off of the landing. There's not enough dry tons there. Getting it to the mill. Could you process it there? I mean, there's not very many of those machines out there. And so for us, that's one of the ones that we'll just wait and see what happens, because there's no push anymore. And it used to be, Corsia went through, and then, the pandemic crashed everybody's flying. But I totally agree with you. I think that is the best way. And whoever the customer is, to support these sort of initiatives that are benefiting all. It can't be just the industry's job to get it out. It has to be supported.
So Erin, did you want to follow up on that? I just saw you move forward.
No, I was just looking at the chat. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I am too. And I'm cognizant of the cool questions that are coming in, but not able to process all of them. Let's at least go a little bit with our planned questions as we can, and we do want to get to what people are writing, so please keep those coming in. Casey, this got me thinking, if and when you're representing a larger entity like Manulife at this point, your opportunities change at some level. What I mean by that is, your access to capital, legal expertise, the ability to maybe offer something at scale that can be sold, or other things that might not be as applicable to smaller landowners. I'm just wondering if you would be interested in sharing what you can, or are thinking about the most promising things at large scale in terms of non-timber revenue streams, and then maybe those that scale down as well. Was that too abstract?
No, I think Manulife is very large, but we're still localized. And so I'm in Vancouver, and my bread and butter is, Washington to California. But it is definitely a benefit that I have all these resources to pursue. We can streamline projects, and we have people that can sort of come together and assist when needed. I think obviously, I'll say that carbon is going to be where a lot of time is spent with our large industrial groups. I hope that forecasted mitigation units get better footing. I think that is one of those carbon plays that is really new, but it's kind of exciting, the idea that we are starting to look at reforestation, not just that improved forest management carbon, because it's not a break even. The forecasted mitigation units don't actually pay for the replanting. It is just an incentive to actually replant if it's regen that is burned 3 seasons in a row. You're not going to replant it. And this is the way to be able to do it. And I think that that's really a benefit for everybody. Long term, I hope more types of carbon that is really the additionality feels there to me start to come forward. And as a large group, I think that we're able to sort of lay that groundwork by investing in them early to try and get those kinks hammered out. So.
Okay, so carbon comes to mind, obviously. What's second?
So second for us, you know, I'm going to group in the carbon capture, storage, direct air capture into carbon. So I'm not going to talk about that. But recreation, I think, is one of our largest opportunities in a large landowning area. We tend to not want to block up any federal lands. And so in the Northwest, we don't have licensed ground or leased ground like they do in the Southern Division, but we do enroll in the Access and Habitat Program in Washington State, or the Free to Hunt in Washington, Oregon State, Washington State, just to make sure that the BLM land, I mean, if any of you guys know what ONC lands are, it's a pretty crazy system of checkerboarding in the West Coast of Oregon. And being able to be a timber company that's not going to make money on it, it's a break even. And that's one of the really hard things that we try. It's not about making money on recreation. It's about encouraging people out into the woods and not having them destroy the roads, destroy the gates, you know, bring in an ATV, dump a bunch of garbage. We need to, I think it's 80 cents an acre that we take to maintain higher security, employ the, you know, correct group of people to be there to deflect. But I mean, those are the things that we spend most of our time managing, you know, hunting licenses, leases. We have some permit programs for those areas that are really locked up that we know is a very large hunting area. We try and permit it so that there's not 10,000 people there, there's 1,000 people there maybe, and, you know, police it better, assign keys. But I think recreation will continue to grow for us because previously it was really lock it up. You know, we had the, you're allowed to walk into our property anywhere you want. It's not closed. But then we realized that really the best way to get out that forest health and that, you know, this forest land is for the population. We're the stewards of the land is by allowing access to the masses. And so we've got mountain bike trails and, you know, we've looked at lots of camping. It's a really hard thing to get somebody to have a campfire on forest land, but I think we're going to continue to grow in recreation for number 2. Sorry, that was a long answer, but my second answer is recreation.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? It's recreation, but it's break even.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Erin. I saw you reaching for your mouse. Maybe I thought you were going to say something and I cut you off. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I continue to have split between the chat and the discussion, but I do think that recreation is a big opportunity in some places. And I think that small scale landowners have missed out on a lot of these diversified revenue opportunities. So, you know, it's interesting that carbon markets come up so much when there's really, it's hard to get into at least the cap and trade carbon market, which has higher prices for your carbon. So it's really hard to get into that unless you have a pretty large land holding. But I think that there's maybe some creative thinking around things like carbon markets and recreation if landowners can kind of act together. So one thing that's happened in California is that, you know, cannabis prices have crashed, and that was really the non-timber forest product in Humboldt County. And so a lot of small landowners are really struggling. And I guess this is sort of a long shot, but I would love to see recreation in places where there's not as much public land become more of a driver and sort of something that small scale landowners can think about, because we know that small scale landowners are economically often very tenuous. They're sort of marginal in terms of their land, their decision making. And I saw that Roger said that working forest conservation easements is a potential major source of income. And something that hasn't been explored a lot is also access easements. There is a lot of trespass that goes on in forest lands, and access easements is another way to start thinking about revenue generation. It could be that there's even benefits to the state from more from paying for more access easements.
So before we go to questions, because I feel like we're kind of running out of time, but of course that always happens in these sort of things. I want to make sure each of you has had a chance to share what you thought you might share. Like, have we missed something in the questioning that you think is important for the work that you're doing and thinking about this topic that you'd like to add in?
I'll jump in with a couple thoughts, sort of building on this. Your earlier question about how can we strengthen engagement? And I think in some ways recreation is a big component of that. For me, recreation is more a means to an end. I think getting people out in the forest and understanding what forest can provide is really, really important. And I think, you know, the cliche that, oh, milk comes in a bottle that grows in the grocery store, that, you know, where do your wood products come from? That is a question that most people don't answer or don't have an answer to. Where do all of these different products that we can provide from the forest, where do those come from? They come from, people know your table, your floor, your walls come from a tree, but where did that tree come from? And those are important questions to ask to sort of help get the juices flowing and people starting to think about what they're buying. And the best way to do that is to get people out into the forest and to realize, oh, forests are not just parks, but they're working forests also. And they can be, you can recreate in a working forest. And I think, you know, for us, we have trouble. We would never want to charge for recreation. Recreation sort of seems like somewhat of a right. We regulate it to an extent in that, I think sort of like Cristina said, we need to manage that access, but so that it's respectful of the forest. But recreation is something we always want to say yes to. But I think every time someone gets out in the forest, they start to understand a little bit more about what those forests can provide. And I really see recreation as a very important tool in this. You know, we've tried to put on as many tours as possible to get people out into the forest here and learn about what we do. Those are really powerful.
Okay, others?
Yes, I would like to add, that was awesome. Totally agree with all of that. And landowners, especially smaller landowners, are critical to communicating all of the multiple values to society of forests. I want to add that there's something like $150 million out there right now for restoration of forests. That's part of the infrastructure bill. And in the conversation that we had about forest products, the federal government will buy up as many seeds as it possibly can. So there is already a market there for that. Not only that, the federal government will help people create seed growing businesses. So that is a huge opportunity, and they're struggling, the federal government, to get people engaged in this. So that gets to the storytelling part of it. In terms of the traditional ecological knowledge piece of this, every tribal nation, just about all over the world, maybe not in the Arctic region so much, in our medicine bundle, there's always seeds. And they're seeds of what today we call keystone species. And these are the plants that anchor the whole ecosystem, create healthy soils that then enable healthy forests to grow. So there's so much room for collaboration right now. And not only that, it's critical that we collaborate because nobody is going to figure this out, without like really coming together. But there's a lot of financial opportunities right now to partner with the government across cultures. And I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions.
That was great. Let's sort of finish rounds of adding. Casey or Erin, did we miss something that you were hoping to talk about or thought was important that, yeah, somehow I haven't gotten to?
Well, I would just mention that as an educator, what we've heard a ton about lately has been actually a workforce shortage. And a lot of this is driven by, again, in California, but also in Oregon and other places, a need to manage forest lands for fuels reduction projects, restoration projects. I mean, fuels reduction is kind of the center of it, but there's really this need to do all kinds of management. And so there have been a flurry of reports and funding trying to actually just get more students into forestry schools and to create more forestry schools. And I think it's been kind of, I guess it's a mixed bag. I mean, in some ways we're looking at this forest health crisis and we're looking at all these problems. And on the other hand, our students are just incredibly in demand, and it's just this field that is growing, and it's bringing all this energy, and people who might not have thought of themselves as foresters, I think, are coming into it. And we're seeing people who might, people getting hired from environmental science and all these other departments going into forestry. This is related to revenue in some ways because there is a labor shortage out there. Anything that involves forest management is going to be tough for people, but I think that there's going to be this huge energetic workforce coming out, and I also think that a lot of people are going to be needed to address all the shifts that are happening in forestry. And so creating revenue streams is going to be really important. Again, I kind of see the state as being central to that, but also matching that with a workforce that is ready to go out there and work in the woods is super important. So Ben, I think it's great that you're talking about like getting people out in the woods and having people on your property. And I think that that's a huge part of getting people who want to work in the woods, is starting by thinking about like, what does this mean? And sort of, yeah, starting to feed this pipeline of people who are going to be needed to work in the woods.
Great. Before we go to questions, Casey, is there anything you think we should add to this?
No, yeah, more foresters would be great. I think we could entice a new generation of foresters if we started really combining it with sustainability. Like Erin's saying, it's not just about now administering log contracts. It's also about, ecosystems and restoration and managing the land for more than just timber. So I feel like if we started piggybacking these to this forest health, we could potentially entice a bunch more people that want to go into sustainability into coming and playing in the woods. Because honestly, I can't think of a better job than getting to be a forester. So, yeah,
great.
Workforce.
Thank you. So like looking at the questions, how to do this, I think the first question came from Neil. Wendy, I see you have your camera on. Can I do Neil's question first, and then maybe you can ask your question if you want to do it in person? Neil, did you want to ask your question, or do you want me to just paraphrase it? I don't know where you're at. I've got too many people on a screen.
Sure, go ahead and paraphrase it. Very
okay, and then please, you can clarify whatever maybe I didn't get to. So we have this idea of thinking about FSC certified lumber, and just this idea of certified lumber overall as being a possible way that landowners might access additional value for a change in management, or for products that otherwise they might not have been incentivized to create in some way. And so in here we've got kind of a question in relation to the California market, and do any of our major our major institutions, UW, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, have policies of purchasing projects with that FSC certified lumber? Discuss.
The answer is yes. Most all of the big companies do have sustainable sourcing policies, and FSC is often a part of that. FSC is one tool in the toolbox, and it's at times a useful tool. With FSC, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. We either have not enough supply in one spot and not enough demand over another spot, and trying to balance that flow of FSC wood products can be challenging and frustrating at times, but it's an important part of the mix.
Can I clarify?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Well, what I was told was in connection with our forest that that most mills are not eager to process FSC lumber. That takes a lot of extra effort on their part, and there just isn't a big market in Washington State. I was also told that California, for various reasons, has much more incentive for the mills to process the FSC lumber. And so that was a sort of disincentive in Washington, if that's correct. And so I don't really understand why there's not, if it's true that there's not a big market for it in Washington State, I don't really understand why that would be.
I guess I might speak to Washington State a little bit, since we, we're working towards being FSC certified. But, the idea of where would FSC certified logs go has sometimes been a question mark, and especially in relation to where would FSC certified logs go in a way that they were paying a premium for that wood above what we could get at another mill. And the difference between getting a premium and not is how much time, money, energy are we putting into the certification, versus what is the value proposition or the actual monetization of the difference in management. And that can become a difficult thing, without mill infrastructure in place.
So you're saying that it's a difficult thing in Washington State to really get
well, Rowan might know something. I don't mean to put Rowan on the spot in terms of where are the FSC mills, if there are any. But this was always a question for us, right? Remember that if you have small volumes of FSC lumber coming to the mill, then the way to maintain all the chain of custody and other rules that would go with processing that wood and certifying it to be sold mean that you have to shut down the mill or stop the production, put a line through, make sure you know where everything went, and that even if it's a small amount of downtime, can be kind of an onerous ask for a mill that's on tight margins. So if a mill was totally FSC and they were close enough to the landowner, it might work terrific.
And do you know about the, can I just ask, do you know about the institutions, like for example, University of Washington, does that have a policy of FSC?
I'm sure we have a sourcing policy. I don't know if it has anything to do with FSC lumber. Seth, maybe you're going to help me out here with the mills. I would appreciate that if you want to add in.
Well, just a couple things. One, that it's not necessary for a mill to shut down and then run exclusively FSC logs. There's a couple of different ways you can go. You can have FSC mix or FSC credits, so that you're not actually, it's more like when you buy green energy, say from your utility, it's not necessarily the same kilowatt hours that come out of the wall for you that went in from a wind farm or solar farm. So that issue has been addressed already by FSC, but I think there's a couple of other issues that are in the way for mills considering FSC. One is the idea of consistent demand and any sort of premium. Right now, given the state of the lumber markets, there's certainly no need for mills to consider other ways of raising their ability to bring in revenue. And the second is, I think that there's kind of an ideological hangover from the timber wars, and FSC was associated ideologically with one side of the timber wars, and it's been very hard, even over the decades, for it to shake that association.
I'll say that the way that it's worked for the mills in the Redwood region is that there was a sort of push, I think it was based on consumer boycott, for Home Depot to source redwood certified, FSC certified redwood, so just that species. And then the landowners here are very large scale, and so they just certified the 2 biggest landowners, and then almost all the wood that's going to the FSC mill then is FSC certified. But there is a small amount that comes off of non-FSC lands, but it's that consistent supply from 2 huge landowners who have FSC certification that keeps it. And then one of those landowners owns the mill, so it's vertically integrated. That's how it works here. That's why we have so much FSC.
And it's maybe worth noting that what I think was the first mill to become FSC certified at scale in California was owned by Mendocino Redwood Company, which was the company formed by the Fisher family, which founded the Gap, to buy out Louisiana Pacific in 1998. And so they were new players in the timber business, and they didn't have this ideological legacy that they were dealing with as other companies might.
So perhaps we can switch to Wendy's question. Wendy, are you prepared to ask a question?
Sure. I actually have 2 questions, and
Good.
I know a whole lot more about FSC than I did 2 minutes ago or whatever. Those are great conversation there. And my question that had to do with FSC, I was curious whether carbon projects that are FSC certified help boost the number of logs in a particular area that would be going to an FSC mill. I worked on a big California compliance project in California that was FSC certified. So I was thinking that perhaps as there are more carbon projects, if those are certified projects, that it might help build FSC in Oregon and Washington. Does that seem likely, or thoughts on that?
I think it seems possible, right? So yeah, if in fact we're able to get a carbon credit to FSC managed land, which is reasonable, right? Due to a change in management, if people would be amenable to that, then one could imagine part of a carbon project could be the combination of FSC driven working forest land that would also receive a carbon credit and consideration that could help build capacity. I think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it.
I was thinking that you could maybe, if there were a premium for FSC and you had a carbon credit, again, you might get a little bump up. The project I worked on was California Compliance Fund, which required a certification, and the certification they got was FSC. And I gather that there are more and more voluntary projects, and I don't know whether they tend to be linked with a meaningful certification or not. Anyone know if are voluntary projects connected with certification typically?
To my knowledge, they don't have to be. The voluntary market's just so much more diverse, of course, but they're trying to make, they being people who are participating in the voluntary market, I think, try to make their projects as, you know, what's the word, reputable, I guess, as real as they can, and certification is one of the ways you can demonstrate that. I mean, in the compliance market, you're right, you have to be, it's FSC or SFI, and I think there's some way you can demonstrate sustainability without having certification. But in the voluntary market, that would be a really interesting question. I think that in order to try and get voluntary carbon credits that really are going to be anywhere near the price that you get for the regulatory market, you do want to have kind of some similar requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So the voluntary market projects that I'm familiar with are sort of mirroring some of the regulatory requirements. But I'm not sure. I don't think that there's any kind of, you don't have to do that. And I've heard about all kinds of new carbon projects that are very different from the regulatory market. They're short term, they can be really small scale, they can do all kinds of stuff. So I think you're going to see a lot of different types of voluntary projects.
Yeah, I mean, I can echo that. All of our timberland is SFI certified, but I don't think it's a requirement of voluntary. I think it's that you're then trying to validate to the buyer that your carbon credits are worth anything, because we have SFIs and this is how we manage our property, and we undergo audits. We're SFI everywhere. So I don't know if it's a requirement, but I think that it's definitely a part of how you're going to want to sell them later. So I don't know.
Thanks. I have another question, but I will turn it over to someone else. We can do the other one if there's time at the end.
Yeah, let's see. Other questions?
Peter asked a question. Where should leadership in improving more diverse forest-related markets come from? If innovation is needed, how might we best foster and support it?
It's a very good Peter-like question. Does anybody want to take that one on?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it needs to come from everywhere. That's an easy answer. But I think our institutions, our states, our regulatory agencies need to help the conversation by acknowledging there's more to a forest than the timber that comes off of the forest. And I think, we are in the trenches trying to tell customers that there's more to a forest than the board feet. But I think changing our regulatory structure that acknowledges that. Right now, our systems are often very much set up for timber. Changing that narrative can come from a lot of different places, but I think one of the places can be from the government, from the state, from the folks who are holding the cards.
It's interesting what happened there, Ben. I think you said timber, but then also you went into an echo mode of saying timber more times, which gave it extra emphasis, which was extraordinary. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Other questions? Seth, are you queued for a question, or you just popped on my screen for another microphone reason? I'm not sure. Sorry to catch you in that position. Wendy, maybe you want to ask your other question?
I'm happy to. I'd be curious to hear people's answers. I'm often hearing about the size of logs that mills can take as being a limiting factor, too large, small, not just right, three bears-ish. But I'm wondering if the people are working on developing technology to make it more convertible, to help create more flexibility. It kind of links what we were talking about in terms of having people come out of forestry schools with technology skills and building those kind of workforces. And I was thinking about the technology on the mill side. What do people see happening there?
And
from an investment side, I hate to say it, but the trees are getting smaller that go to the mill. And I would really love to see carbon programs that set back the date and reset the mills larger. That's got to be top down again. But yeah, if we were back at 50 to 60 years, 70 years, and all the mills were sized for a 11-inch, I mean, it's just not, it's a good point, and I've thought about it. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So I have a little bit to say, and Ben, I'm just giving you warning that I'm going to ask you as somebody who actually deals with the mill. But we have this situation where there have been times where the sort of intake portion of the mill has been not well suited to what logs someone wants to deliver. right? So there are times where oversized logs don't have a home. And then there are some times where there is a mill where you can take something oversized to a certain point, and that changes sort of your management planning, perhaps. It certainly might change what stand you would cut or not cut. Along these lines, if you follow the log prices and confirmation of what Casey was saying, a strange thing happened a couple of years ago, if I read the markets right, that the 8 to 11-inch Doug fir logs became more valuable than number 2 Douglas fir logs. And in my mind, this feels fundamentally wrong. Yet alone what the price might be for a special mill or something that might be a peeler log, that was certainly a lot more care or time was put into, the production of that type of saw timber. So I don't know, Ben, if you have anything to share in thinking about the mills.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Casey's right. I mean, the mills are continuing to retool smaller and smaller, and we're continuing to lose big log mills. The technology for big logs is really shifting to smaller, and I think it has to do with scale. And I think all of these conversations over the course of this afternoon really have to do with scale. It's a lot easier to find a small mill that will that is interested in FSC certified logs. It is a lot easier to find a small mill that might be able to handle large logs. And as our mills continue to consolidate and there's fewer and fewer larger and larger mills, we're kind of moving in the wrong direction. But I think, we have a small operation and we specialize in a particular set of products. And the more small to mid-sized mills there are, the more adaptability, the more capacity, the more flexibility there will be in the industry. And there's great, fairly modern technology on a small to medium scale for processing big logs. But no one's investing in large scale processing of big logs because there aren't large scale. It's a chicken and egg problem again. We've lost most of our big logs. And it really comes on the scale and helping to promote small and mid-sized mills to fill those niches that are missing right now.
Okay. Stacey, I see a question from Rosalind here. Did I miss one, or I think you
address this one? Aesthetics are important for a lot of people. Has anyone heard of something like landowners being paid for view shed easements? It's a great idea.
I haven't. It is an interesting idea. I mean, people do a lot of work on sort of valuing forests in a non-market way through models to see like how they affect real estate values. So there is some price signal there that people have figured out, but I don't know how exactly you would do that, but that's an interesting idea. I think the easements can be used really creatively. I mentioned earlier access easements. I think people should explore more about easements that sort of, you can pull apart all the values of a forest and sort of sell the pieces. And the aesthetics I've never heard of. I don't know if anybody else has, but I think that would be a really hard one. I think it'd be easier to incentivize through an easement something like changing something about the aesthetic. So if that's linked to management, to like growing bigger blocks of trees, to maintaining, you'd probably put the easement on that management activity as opposed to the aesthetics, which I think would be really hard.
I can think of one time that we did it, but we actually didn't end up charging anything. A lot of the times we're not near any population, and in those small instances where you're building a relationship with a town, you don't, to leave that 10 acres that buffered everything and made their life better it's not a difficult trade to give. I mean, you've built a relationship. our town was on the beach and had we logged one section of the hill, it would have not seen trees anymore. It would have been, a clear cut. So it was a leaf tree. But we do get that proposed, and I don't know, I think an easement is actually a super interesting idea. We talked about management agreements and watersheds. And so we don't spray watersheds and we don't log watersheds, but it's not something written. And so we had considered writing out every single thing that you could want to do in a watershed and never do it, and then sell that right to the city so they don't have to buy the land, but next landowner, they don't have to worry about it happening. So that was one of the kind of related topics.
Great. I see Kate Anderson's hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for such a great discussion. And I'm fascinated by this chicken and egg mill problem that Ben kind of named like that, and that everyone's kind of talking about. And I think it gets back to Peter Hayes's question about who's going to lead us, who's going to lead all this, and Dr. Kelly's a couple of different times emphasize the importance of top down as well as kind of bottoms up. You need both at the same time. But for example, why are all these forestry jobs open now? It's because of a top down funding for fuels reduction and things like that. So it seems like, and also, so my brother works at a mill, and he's also really politically involved from the timber industry perspective. And he just flew to Washington, D.C. to say, go ahead and pass this, because apparently the Forest Service was saying we don't really have the personnel to administer all of the funds. And so the Forest Service is saying, so hold on the spigot. And so my brother was saying, no, just contract it out. And so, and we'll tie all these ends together. And so it seems like if there was a kind of a recognized leadership organization, kind of maybe a bunch of forestry nonprofits in a round table, and maybe that exists, that the federal government, instead of just going to the timber industry for how to organize this funding, would and like the Oregon Forest Industry Council and things like that, would also come to another kind of recognized group, and then that group could help guide the funding in a synchronized way to get over this chicken and egg problem. And so you have the mills, the chicken and egg, but it also needs to be kind of geographic. So within a government with kind of an kind of oversight leadership group could say, this region, we're going to grow long rotations, and then we're going to incentivize mills and guarantee. So I think that leadership question is really important. And I think it goes with Erin's, kind of emphasis that we need a huge investment, whether it's like a dramatic policy like the Northwest Forest Plan, which guaranteed no big logs, or a lot of money.
Thank you for that. That was interesting. I do see this one last question I think we should work through in the chat before we wrap up. And Cristina, I wonder if you want to follow up on Philip's question regarding a connection to small landowners and tribes in the Southern Willamette Valley. Maybe you can expand on this in a way that might be helpful to the whole group, or?
Yes, be happy to. So there is currently, as I mentioned, a deficit of materials for restoration of degraded lands, not just forests, all kinds of federal lands in the United States. And there's a strong push by the government to empower tribal nations to be some of the people doing that work. There's also huge opportunity for small landowners. If people want to follow through on this, I suggest you look up the Seeds of Success program. It's just, type that in. It's run by the BLM. The program lead is Peggy Olwell. She's actually the botanist for the whole United States. And she started this program 20 years ago. And she can help connect you, because right now with what's happening, all the ecological disasters we're facing right now, the federal government is scrambling to support production of seed. So there's a funding stream through the Forest Service. There's another funding stream through the Department of Interior at the BLM level and above the BLM level. So there's many millions of dollars for this, and there's not enough people involved. And those people can be landowners, tribal nations, basically anybody who wants to be involved with this.
That was great. Thank you. I think this would be a good time for us to wrap up, given the fact that we have only a couple of more minutes. And first, thank you to everybody for coming. I know you have other things to do with your time. Hopefully this was somewhat enriching. Most importantly, thank you to all our panelists who generously gave us their time and helped us think in a lot of new directions. So I really appreciate that. I know I learned a lot. I want to remind everyone that we're connected, if you will, in a conversation that's been going on now for 3 Thursdays. Next Thursday, the title is Working Together, New Partnerships in Forest Ownership and Conservation, where we can work into this a little bit more. I want to, I guess, feel a little bit awkward putting in a pitch for coming to the field sites at Pack Forest at the end of September, since I don't know, I've been putzing around in the woods with a whole bunch of things for a long time and would like some people to come and see what we've been doing. So if you have a chance, that would be great. And we'll have an opportunity to all get together and engage. Stacey, is there anything I have missed?
I don't think so. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks. Okay, thank you all. And please find a way to share your appreciation for all of our panelists. I know I'm grateful. Thank you so much.